Poof, $8 billion just poofed into thin air overnight. I'm Gregory Hale, your guide through this mess. 10 years chasing dirty money for big news outlets, plus another stint vetting shady deals for a Fortune 500 bank. I've seen the sausage making up close Wall Street's finest bending rules, digital currency outfits rewriting them while regulators blink. But this is the part the headlines skipped. You're about to watch the forensic deep dive nobody saw coming. The hidden spreadsheet an engineer dug up, the shadowy Project Alameda that turned an exchange into a backroom bank, and the dominoes that let an $8 billion sinkhole stay buried until the whole house collapsed. Fine print, we've swapped real names to keep probes quiet. Every detail comes straight from court filings or reports from journalists who actually did the legwork. Start with the SEC's own damn complaint. FTX quietly yanked at least $8 billion from customer stashes and funneled it to Alameda Research, flipping dollars from FTX's U.S. bank vaults to hide the heist straight-up securities violations. Source: SEC complaint. When the engineer logged into the back-office terminal, the screen lit up like a Christmas tree big red banner screaming $8 billion missing. The numbers flat out didn't add up, and the audit trail was a hall of mirrors. Intercompany transfers that should have had collateral attached, yet none existed. He sat there, pulse hammering, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. No collateral. Soon that phrase would ricochet around courtrooms and CNNs alike. Buried beneath that cold phrase sat a black box hedge fund called Project Alameda. Later, when the New York Times pried open internal docs, it read like a horror story. Alameda operated like a shadow bank, borrowing billions in cold hard cash from FTX while posting nothing but FTX's house token FTT as phony collateral. Source: NYT Investigative Journalism. Turns out the engineer wasn't alone. Court papers later spelled it out in black and white. FTX's dollar piggy bank was actually empty, a $8.9 billion IOU floating in thin air with Alameda's loans painted over as intercompany IOUs. Source: Bankruptcy Court Filing. Not even the suits in Washington clocked it. Federal Reserve and SEC postmortems admit FTX gamed the system, skirting dollar liquidity alarms and letting Alameda's credit line balloon past every red line for months without a peep. Source: Reuters Regulatory Report. So here's the trillion-dollar question, well, technically the $8 billion question that keeps regulators up at night. How do you park an $8 billion black hole in plain sight for years, and what does that say about a market built on ones and zeros instead of actual dollars? The engineer's screen was a puzzle palace of numbers, timestamps, and a single line of code that should have shrieked danger. The alert never blared. Instead, a parade of internal transfers tiptoed past every safeguard, each tagged as a routine cash shuffle. What greased the wheels was FTX's own architecture, one ledger to rule them all, shared by the exchange and Alameda. When the engineer traced the money's trail, he realized the $8 billion had been laundered through a maze of intercompany book entries, each tagged FTT collateral while the token itself traded like monopoly money. The fraud wasn't just hiding the missing cash, it was hiding in plain speed. Dollars exited FTX's U.S. bank accounts, zipped into Alameda's vault, and reappeared as liquidity on the exchange's books within seconds. To outsiders, the balance sheet looked pristine. To the engineer, the absence of real collateral was a klaxon no algorithm could translate. Legal filings later peeled back the curtain. The $8 billion wasn't one fat transfer but a gazillion drip drops, each slice small enough to dodge the Federal Reserve's liquidity radar and the SEC's surveillance bots. Classic smurfing, and it worked like a charm. The engineer's bombshell ricocheted through compliance. Inboxes exploded with urgent Alameda wire review and possible customer fund abuse. Yet the response was the corporate version of meh. Senior brass shrugged and labeled it normal market ops, a phrase that would later sound like nails on a chalkboard. When the truth blasted out, markets cratered. FTT, the token masquerading as collateral, melted faster than a snowball in July, vaporizing billions in a blink. Customers woke up to empty wallets, and traditional banks suddenly found themselves holding hot potatoes they hadn't signed up for. The contagion spread far beyond crypto. The engineer, he wasn't some whistleblower, he was a cog in a machine that worshipped speed and code over checks and balances. No collateral became the silent scream trapped in his throat, the smoking gun proving the whole empire was a house of cards. SEC complaints, NYT deep dives, bankruptcy filings, Reuters ledgers, every single source lands on the same conclusion. A coordinated, multi-layered masquerade disguised a liquidity disaster as a winning strategy. Engineering, compliance, C-suite, every layer played a part in the greatest disappearing act in financial history. Now, as investigators rifle through petabytes of data, the engineers' logs stand out like a flare in the dark. They prove the platform could have screamed the truth, but the people in charge chose silence. So here's the kicker: if one engineer could spot the gaping hole, how did everyone else sleepwalk past it? That's the puzzle we're cracking open. Aerial shot of FTX's Bahamas headquarters, then tied on a server room door labeled Project Alameda Restricted Access. In November 2022, everyone was glued to the news as FTX, the crypto exchange once valued at $32 billion, collapsed overnight. Yet the real story stretches back years, built on a deliberate financial illusion of borrowed dollars, fake collateral, and a single engineer's discovery that still haunts regulators. On screen, FTX's rise from $1.2 billion valuation 2019 to $32 billion 2021. FTX didn't just grow, it exploded. Founded in 2019 by Sam Bankman-Fried, it marketed itself as a cutting-edge crypto platform with a twist, a proprietary dollar liquidity model. Unlike traditional exchanges that keep customer funds in segregated accounts, FTX moved dollars between its US-based banks and international operations in real time. The problem? That money wasn't always where it claimed to be. Zoom into an old FTX promotional video: instant USD liquidity, always available. By 2021, internal documents show FTX's US dollar reserves were being stretched thin, used to fund Alameda Research, the hedge fund Bankman-Fried also controlled. Alameda wasn't just a trading arm, it was a shadow bank borrowing billions from FTX's customer funds to place leveraged bets, and the collateral, mostly FTT, the exchange's own token. Source: The New York Times, March 9, 2023. Split screen: left side shows FTX's liquid dashboard. Right side shows Alameda's internal ledger marked INTRCOMPNY transactions, $8.9 billion. That wasn't just risky, it was fraudulent. In September 2022, an engineer, let's call him Engineer X, was tasked with auditing Alameda's books. What he found wasn't a hedge fund. It was a house of cards, no dollar collateral, no real reserves, just red flag transactions disguised as loans. On screen, Engineer X: I couldn't speak when I saw it, no collateral, it was all fake. Engineer X's notes, later filed in bankruptcy court, describe fabricated ledgers, fake invoices, and $8.9 billion in liabilities that simply didn't exist. The money wasn't in FTX's US bank accounts, it had already been sent to Alameda. Source: Courthouse News, FTX bankruptcy complaint, January 2023. Close-up of a handwritten note: Alameda's loans to FTX customers equals $0 backing. Pure fiction. But how did this go unnoticed? Blame the model and weak oversight. FTX exploited gaps in dollar liquidity monitoring. Federal Reserve and SEC reports from 2022 reveal that Alameda's borrowings exceeded regulatory thresholds for months. FTX moved customer funds between its Bahamian entity and U.S. banks without proper segregation or disclosure. Source: Reuters, November 17, 2022. Montage: FTX US logo next to a red violation stamp. Regulators knew. In October 2022, the SEC sent a Wells notice to FTX. It warned of material weaknesses in internal controls. But by then the damage was done. The transfers were already happening. The dollars were already gone. Source: SEC complaint, October 2022. On screen: Project Alameda, not a hedge fund, a slush fund. Project Alameda wasn't a hedge fund, it was a cash pipeline. Internal emails show Bankman-Fried personally approved loans to Alameda totaling billions. The collateral, FTT tokens, valued at inflated prices. When markets turned, so did the fiction. Alameda's balance sheet collapsed, FTX's reserves evaporated, and $8.9 billion in customer money vanished. Source: SEC complaint, October 2020. Zoom out to a courtroom sketch of Sam Bankman-Fried, looking down as prosecutors present evidence. Deloitte's post-collapse forensic review confirmed the worst. FTX's dollar-denominated reserves were non-existent. No real dollars, no real backing. Just accounting sleight of hand. Source: Financial Times, excerpts from Deloitte report. Black screen with white text. The engineer's silence wasn't choice, it was shock. Engineer X didn't just see missing collateral, he saw a system designed to hide theft. The ledgers were altered, the wires were disguised, and when he tried to report it, he was told to stay quiet because Project Alameda wasn't a backup plan, it was the plan. The entire exchange was built on a lie. Music shifts to a slow, ominous tone, and when the lie collapsed, so did everything else. When the engineer cracked open the ledger that night, the figures seemed to glare back like a flashing warning sign. His job: to reconcile FTX's US dollar ledgers, a supposedly routine audit that ought to have wrapped up in a few hours, not stretched over days. Instead, every line item peeled away another layer of deception, reaching straight into the core of the exchange. First up, the off-exchange dollar liquidity pools. A tangled web of private contracts kept off public order books was moving billions back and forth between FTX's bank accounts and Alameda Research. These pools never showed up on any exchange listing, nor were they reported to the Fed's daily monitoring system. That arrangement let Alameda borrow dollars at essentially zero cost, using FTX's own token, FTT, as a thin veil of collateral. Source: NYT Investigative Journalism. The engineer followed the money trail right to a chain of internal transfer approvals. First, a senior compliance officer signed a risk mitigation memo, then a finance director added his endorsement, and at the end a chief operating officer slapped the label "executed" on the document. None of those signatures set off the automated red flag rules built into FTX's compliance software. Turns out, the software had been deliberately rewired months before to ignore any transfer over $50 million, a ceiling that perfectly matched the hidden loans. When the engineer cross-checked those approvals against the SEC's complaint, the picture suddenly sharpened. The SEC claims that FTX quietly moved at least $8 billion of customer money to Alameda, using dollars from FTX's U.S. bank accounts to hide the fraud. Source: SEC complaint. Those very dollars reappeared in the off-exchange pools, bouncing in and out of Alameda's balance sheet while never showing up in FTX's public statements. A second chain of approvals popped up in the Bankruptcy Court Filing. The filing talks about intercompany transactions that concealed Alameda's loans to FTX customers. According to the filing, those loans were logged as legitimate assets even though the underlying dollar reserves were non-existent. Source: Bankruptcy Court Filing. In practice, the engineer found that the intercompany tag was just a convenient euphemism for a secret ledger that never matched any external bank statement. Meanwhile, regulators were looking in all the wrong places. Federal Reserve and SEC reports reveal that FTX took advantage of gaps in dollar liquidity monitoring, with Alameda's dollar borrowings from FTX's U.S. banks breaching regulatory thresholds for months. Source: Reuters Regulatory Report. Those oversight bodies leaned on quarterly reports that only listed aggregate dollar balances, missing the granular, contract-by-contract breakdown the engineer was now uncovering. Their blind spot: the very architecture of the private contracts, legal instruments that sit outside the standard banking entity definition. Deloitte's post-collapse review added yet another layer of confirmation. The audit highlighted serious gaps in FTX's accounting for its dollar reserves, noting that internal controls failed to detect or prevent the misstatement of dollar-denominated assets. Source: Financial Audit. The engineer saw that the audit's findings weren't just a post-mortem footnote. They were a roadmap pinpointing exactly where the fraud slipped through the cracks. The climax hit when the engineer performed a final reconciliation, adding up every private contract, approved transfer memo, and hidden intercompany entry yielded $8.9 billion in liabilities with no backing. That figure lined up with the SEC's $8 billion claim, confirming the missing dollars weren't a rounding glitch but a deliberate siphon. In that instant, the engineer felt the full weight of the deception. The off-exchange liquidity pool manipulation wasn't a slip-up. It was a calculated scheme to hide billions from regulators while feeding Alameda's shadow bank operations. Each approval, each tweaked compliance rule, was a stitch in a fabric deliberately woven to conceal the truth. The regulator's blind spot was crystal clear. Oversight tools that zero in on publicly reported balances can't snag a web of private contracts masquerading as internal transfers. Combined, the Federal Reserve and SEC reports, plus the internal documents, lay bare a systemic failure to monitor dollar-backed contracts operating outside the traditional banking framework. Finally, the engineer's epiphany raised a bigger question. How many other exchanges could be hiding similar off-exchange pools to mask liquidity gaps? For now, the answer lives in the pages of court filings and audit reports, but the pattern is unmistakable. The vanished $8 billion disappeared because a handful of insiders built a parallel dollar ecosystem, one that regulators simply lacked the tools to see. As the camera sweeps over piles of PDFs and spreadsheets, the narrator leans in with a low whisper. When the engineer finally grasped the scale, the fraud stopped being a mystery, it became a blueprint. The screen flickers, flashing the exact line from the SEC complaint. FTX secretly transferred at least $8 billion in customer funds to Alameda Research. Those words echo, underscoring the stark reality that the collapse wasn't a sudden crash but a meticulously staged withdrawal. The segment wraps with a final beat, a freeze frame of the engineer's screen, the red highlighted $8.9 billion and a ticking clock overlay. That ticking clock reminds viewers that once time's gone, it can't be reclaimed, and that the same mechanisms that enabled the fraud could, if uncovered, stop the next one. The FTX collapse didn't just bruise the crypto world. It left a deep, ugly gash across every wallet, every exchange, and every trader who ever trusted that markets could police themselves. You know the drill. When the SEC dropped that complaint, investors got the full ugly picture. FTX wasn't just shady. It was moving at least $8 billion in customer cash straight to Alameda Research like it was spare change source. One minute you're watching your balance tick up. The next, bam, the whole system's gasping for air as withdrawals start flooding out like a broken dam. And then the real kicker, internal docs leaked that Alameda wasn't just borrowing billions. It was doing it with nothing backing those loans, propped up by the FTT token like a house of cards source. Suddenly, crypto wasn't the rebellious alternative to Wall Street anymore. It was just another rigged game where the house always wins. The bankruptcy filings didn't just confirm the fraud, they shoved the numbers in everyone's face. $8.9 billion in liabilities and the dollar reserves. Total fiction, shuffled around between shell companies like Monopoly Money, source. Even the regulators admitted they were asleep at the wheel. Dollar liquidity gaps kept the whole scam humming for months before anyone noticed, source. Now the whole crypto house is shaking. Prices jump like a scared cat. The risk-on buzz that brought in big money is now drowned out by a chorus of wait, really. The fragility isn't some abstract debate anymore, it's the cold reality in every token holder's stomach. So what's next? Policymakers can't just slap a bandage on this, they need a scalpel. First rule, every exchange must prove today that every dollar they claim to hold is actually sitting in a real account. Second, real-time liquidity reports can't be optional, they've got to be baked in, so no one can hide a billion-dollar borrowing spree like Alameda's again, source. And third, no more yearly audits that read like fiction. Deloitte's already called out the overstatement of reserves. Future checks need to be independent, constant, and out in the open for anyone to see, source. Bottom line, only rules that demand honesty, protect users, and treat crypto like the serious market it claims to be can even begin to rebuild trust. And that's where you come in. The people who actually power these markets, the traders, the holders, the true believers, they're the ones who can flip the script. So do this, fire off an email to your reps, demand clear rules on custody, and make those exchanges cough up audited balance sheets. Hit share on this video and slap it in front of anyone still convinced crypto's just the Wild West with no sheriff in sight. Want to stay ahead of the next headline, whether it's a new rule, a hack, or the next pump? Then smash that subscribe button, ding the bell, and get the word out. Together, we can drag crypto out of the shadows and into something safer, smarter, and way more accountable.